Between 1965 and 1973, the United States poured more than $100 billion into putting the best-equipped army on Earth into the jungles of Southeast Asia. The equipment was supposed to keep American teenagers alive. A disturbing amount of it killed them instead. From boots that ate men's feet to grenades that cooked off in their own hands, this is 20 pieces of American gear that put more names on the wall than most firefights. Number 13 is a standard-issue boot that turned the Mekong Delta into an amputee ward. And number 4 is a weapon the enemy learned to turn back on the men who planted it, starting at number 20. Number 20. The insect repellent. The standard-issue bottle of DEET that every grunt carried in Vietnam was strong enough to dissolve plastic, and it did. Men slathered it on in the Ia Drang Valley and watched it eat through their compass housings, their map cases, and the acetate covers on their rifle stocks. A 20-cent bottle of bug juice could destroy $50 worth of navigation equipment in a single afternoon. The Army knew about the problem by 1966, but the alternative was malaria, and malaria killed more soldiers than the Viet Cong did in some provinces that year. So the repellent stayed. Men learned to keep it away from anything they needed to read or aim, but in the monsoon darkness of the Central Highlands, mistakes happened nightly. At least one patrol from the 1st Infantry Division walked blind into a tree line near Phuoc Vinh because a compass housing had cracked from DEET exposure days before, and nobody noticed until the needle froze. The after-action report never said insect repellent. It said navigation error. The distinction mattered to the Army back in Saigon. It did not matter to the dead. Number 19. The inflatable air mattress. The Army issued a rubberized air mattress as part of the infantry sleeping kit, and in garrison, it worked fine. In the jungle, it was a liability. Every shift of a sleeping man's weight produced a squeak that carried through the dark like a signal flare, and along the Cambodian border that squeak carried even farther than a whisper in a place where the enemy listened for both. A platoon from the 25th Infantry Division took fire near Cu Chi in 1966. Because the NVA heard the rubber shifting from 50 meters out and walked their mortar right onto the sleeping position. The mattress weighed almost 2 pounds, and men who ditched it slept on bare ground in standing water, trading silence for trench foot and immersion sores that kept men on light duty for weeks. Either way, the gear cost them. The quartermaster kept issuing mattresses through 1968, and every cycle of new replacements inflated them until a sergeant told them to cut it out. A piece of equipment that announced your position every time you rolled over was not comfort. It was a target. Number 18. The tropical rucksack. The lightweight rucksack the Army designed for jungle warfare had an aluminum frame that looked good on paper and collapsed under load in the field. Men in the 1st Cavalry Division at Bong Son in 1966 reported frames snapping on the 3rd day of a patrol, leaving a soldier with 60 pounds of gear and no way to carry it except draped over his shoulders. The failure rate was high enough that units started abandoning the issued ruck in favor of captured NVA packs, which were heavier but did not break. A replacement frame cost the Army $11. A medevac for a man whose spine gave out under a frameless load cost considerably more, and those evacuations pulled a rifleman off the line for days. The tropical ruck stayed in the supply chain through 1969 because the procurement contract had already been signed for 3 years of production, and canceling it meant someone in Saigon had to explain the write-off. Nobody volunteered. The men in the field solved the problem themselves, which is what men in the field usually did when the supply chain failed them. Number 17. The sea ration. The canned field meals the Army sent to Vietnam were, in many cases, literally left over from the Second World War. Inspectors in 1966 found cans with date stamps from 1945, 21 years old, still being issued to line units in the Delta. A case cost the government $2.40. The calorie count was designed for a temperate European theater, not a country where men lost 5 to 10 pounds a week from sweat alone. The sodium content was enormous, and in a place where clean water was already scarce, the salt drove dehydration that dropped men on patrol and sent them to the battalion aid station on I-5 drips. Treating a single heat casualty in a field hospital cost 100 times the price of the rations that caused it. Units in the 9th Infantry Division supplemented with captured rice and local fruit, which solved the calorie problem but introduced dysentery that sent men to the latrine 20 times a day. The Army spent 2 years pretending neither issue existed, and the men who ate the rations spent the same 2 years pretending the food was edible. Number 16. The steel pot. The M1 helmet had been standard since 1941, and by Vietnam, it was a 25-year-old design fighting a new kind of war. It weighed 2.5 pounds, which does not sound like much until you carry it for 12 hours in a 110-degree heat index along the Song Vi Valley. The steel trapped heat against the skull and the compressed fiber liner inside, absorbed sweat, gained weight, and never fully dried in the monsoon months. Men in the 4th Infantry Division at Dak 2 reported headaches and neck strains so severe they could not sight their rifles by afternoon. But the danger nobody warned them about was spalling. When a round struck the outside of the helmet and did not penetrate, it sometimes knocked steel fragments off the inner surface and drove them into the wearer's scalp like shrapnel from his own armor. A helmet that stopped a bullet could still put a man in surgery. The Army did not replace the steel pot with a lighter composite design until 1983, 8 years after the war ended, and thousands of heat casualties, after anyone should have noticed. Number 15. The trip flare. The M49. A one-trip flare was designed to illuminate an enemy approach, and it did that well enough when everything worked. The problem was everything else. The magnesium compound burned at over 3,000 degrees, and any soldier within 10 feet of an accidental discharge ended up in the burn ward at the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. Perimeter guards at Khe Sanh in early 1968 reported more burn injuries from their own trip flares than from incoming mortar fragments during the same period. The flares were strung on thin wire that monkeys, rats, and monsoon wind triggered as easily as any sapper, which meant false alarms nightly and real burns every week. A single false trigger at 2 in the morning lit up the friendly position for any NVA observer on the wire, while burning magnesium dropped onto the nearest foxhole. Repositioning a flare in daylight was nearly as dangerous, because the wire corroded in the humidity and snapped under the slightest tension. A defensive tool that burned more Americans than enemies is a strange thing to keep issuing, but the trip flare stayed in the inventory through the entire war. Number 14. The Starlight Scope. The AN/PVS-2 was the first-generation night vision device issued to infantry in combat, and it weighed 6 pounds without batteries. With batteries it approached 8, and the batteries lasted about 4 hours before the humidity killed them. A rifleman on a night ambush outside Pleiku in 1967 had to choose between carrying the scope and carrying extra water, and water usually won. The device amplified ambient light well enough to see a man at 200 meters. But the green glow from the eyepiece was visible to anyone looking back, which meant the tool designed to own the night also gave away the position of the man using it. Enemy scouts along the Ho Chi Minh Trail learned to watch for that green dot. The scope cost nearly $3,000 per unit in 1967 money, roughly the annual income of a draftee's family, and units reported loss and breakage rates above 30% per deployment because the optics shattered if the scope was dropped from waist height onto hard ground. A device too heavy to carry, too fragile to survive, and bright enough to betray you. Number 13. In the monsoon months of 1966, medics at the 3rd Field Hospital in Saigon started seeing something they had not expected. Healthy infantrymen were arriving from the Mekong Delta with feet that looked like they had been soaking in acid, the skin white and peeling away in sheets. The culprit was the standard issue jungle boot. The first-generation nylon and leather boot was designed to drain water, but in the paddies of the southern delta, water never stopped coming. The nylon panels held moisture against the skin for days, and the rubber sole sealed in heat. The result was immersion foot so severe that in some companies half the platoon could not walk by the end of a 2-week patrol. The 9th Infantry Division, which operated almost entirely in the Delta, reported foot casualties that rivaled combat wounded during the worst months of 1967. A boot that cost $8.50 produced more medical evacuations than most mortar barrages. The redesigned boot with better drainage did not reach the field until late 1968, and by then, thousands of men had been carried out on stretchers for a wound that never involved a bullet. Number 12. The PRC-25 radio. The field radio was the most important piece of equipment in any infantry platoon, and it was also the most dangerous to carry. The PRC-25 weighed 23 pounds with its battery, and the whip antenna rose 3 feet above the radio man's head, marking him as the single highest value target in the formation. Snipers along the Ia Drang Valley in November 1965 killed radio operators first because dropping the radio dropped the unit's ability to call in artillery and air support. A radio man's life expectancy in a sustained firefight was counted in seconds. The radio worked reliably, but the battery drained in under a day of continuous use, and spare batteries added 5 more pounds to a load already crippling. The unit cost was roughly $270. Replacement operators had to be pulled from the rifle line, which weakened the squad at the moment it needed strength most. A man staggering through triple canopy jungle under 28 pounds of communication gear with a 3-foot antenna advertising his importance to every marksman in the trees was not hard to spot. He was the easiest kill on the field. Number 11. The CS gas grenade. Tear gas was used extensively in Vietnam for tunnel clearing and perimeter defense, and it worked fine until the wind shifted. American units fighting house to house at Hue during the Tet Offensive in February 1968 gassed their own positions repeatedly when grenades thrown into enemy-held buildings drifted back through shattered windows on a crosswind nobody had checked. The CS agent clung to clothing and skin and eyes, and men who had thrown the grenades minutes earlier found themselves choking, half-blind, and stumbling through a firefight they had started. In the tunnels of Cu Chi, CS pumped into one entrance, traveled through passages the Americans had not yet mapped, and came boiling out of exits directly under the covering team on the surface. The chemical was classified as non-lethal, but a man who cannot see or breathe in the middle of a rifle fight is as good as dead. Command classified these as combat casualties, not equipment failures. So the CS grenade's friendly fire record never appeared in a single procurement review. The real number of Americans dropped by their own tear gas has never been counted. Number 10. The M48 Patton Tank. The M48 was a fine piece of armor for the plains of Central Europe. In Vietnam, it was a crematorium on treads. The early models ran on gasoline engines, not diesel, and gasoline ignites at a fraction of the temperature. A single RPG hit to the engine deck could turn the vehicle into a fireball in under 30 seconds, and RPGs were the most common anti-tank weapon in the NVA inventory. Tank crews with the 1st Battalion, 69th Armor near Ben Het in 1969 called their vehicles Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit the first time. The gasoline engine also burned fuel at nearly twice the rate of a diesel, which meant shorter range, more resupply convoys, and more convoys meant more ambushes on roads already killing men every week. The Army eventually retrofitted the M48 with diesel engines to create the M48A3. But the conversion took years, and the gasoline models saw heavy fighting into 1968. Every crewman who climbed into one of those early Pattons understood the arithmetic. The machine built to protect him was the thing most likely to burn him alive. Number 9. The M1952 flak jacket. The body armor issued in Vietnam stopped shrapnel well enough. It was never designed for a jungle. The jacket weighed nearly 8 pounds and trapped body heat so efficiently that the temperature inside the vest ran higher than the air outside it. Commanders in the 173rd Airborne Brigade reported that heat casualties doubled during operations where flak jacket wear was mandatory. Platoon leaders quietly told their men to strip the jackets during patrols and put them on only when they expected contact. The mathematics were bleak. In a month where a company might take 2 or 3 shrapnel wounds, the same company could lose 8 or 10 men to heat exhaustion and heat stroke kills. The jacket that stopped fragments generated more casualties than the fragments themselves. $14 bought the vest. The cost of a single heat evacuation ran far higher, but nobody compared those numbers side by side until the war was over. If you are finding this valuable, tap the like button. It tells the algorithm to show this to more people who care about this history, and it costs you nothing. Number 8. The M67 fragmentation grenade. The M67 was round, reliable, and lethal at 15 meters. It was also perfectly shaped to catch on everything in the jungle. The spoon, the curved metal lever held in place by the pin, snagged on vines, branches, and web gear straps with a regularity that turned routine movement through heavy bush into a gamble. Men in the 101st Airborne Division, operating in the Ashau Valley in 1969, reported accidental spoon releases at least once a week during sustained jungle patrols. A released spoon meant a live grenade with a 4 to 5 second fuse hanging from a soldier's gear in the middle of his own squad. The result was either a very fast reaction or a very bad day for everyone within the blast radius. Some men taped the spoons down with electrical tape, which held until the humidity dissolved the adhesive. Others bent the pins tight, which slowed the draw when they actually needed one. No fix existed that did not create a second problem. The M67 was indispensable and irreplaceable, but it was also the most common source of accidental fragmentation injuries in the American Jungle War. Number 7. White phosphorus. WP rounds were carried as marking munitions and incendiary support, and in Vietnam they earned the name Willie Pete from the men who called them in and the men who ran from them. The problem with white phosphorus is that it does not recognize a uniform. When a marking round landed short, or the wind carried an airburst sideways, the burning fragments fell on American positions exactly as easily as on enemy ones. Forward observers with the 3rd Marine Division at Khe Sanh called in WP markers that drifted back into their own wire on at least 2 documented occasions during the 1968 siege. The substance burns through skin, through cloth, through nearly anything organic, and water does not stop it. Field treatment meant picking burning fragments out with forceps while the casualty screamed, and a medic doing that work under fire in the dark was performing surgery without anesthesia or light. WP injuries were logged as friendly fire, which kept them out of the statistical column reserved for enemy-inflicted casualties, and the full count of Americans burned by their own marking rounds in Vietnam remains unknown. Number 6. The M79 grenade launcher. The men called it the blooper for the sound it made, and they relied on it for close fire support more than almost any other platoon weapon in the war. But the M79 carried a flaw that could not be designed away. The 40mm round required a minimum flight distance before its fuse armed, and any target closer than that distance received either a blunt impact from a dud round or a detonation close enough to put the shooter inside his own fragmentation envelope. Grenadiers with the 25th Infantry Division during operations near the Iron Triangle in 1967 discovered the hard way that a weapon built for 50-meter engagements does not work when the enemy appears at 10 meters through the brush. The M79 was a squad-level weapon, which meant nearly every rifle squad in Vietnam had one, and nearly every squad had a story about a round that went wrong at close range. The blooper undoubtedly saved more lives than it ended, but the lives it ended were almost always American, and they were almost always the grenadier himself or the man standing next to him. Number 5. The M72 Law. The light anti-tank weapon was a disposable rocket launcher that gave every rifleman the ability to crack a bunker, and from the front it did exactly what the manual promised. The problem was behind the shooter. The backblast from an M72 produced a cone of superheated gas that could maim or kill anyone within 15 meters to the rear. In the close terrain of triple canopy jungle and the narrow corridors of tunnel complex approaches near Cu Chi, 15 meters of clear backblast space was a luxury that almost never existed. Soldiers firing LAWs inside the bunker systems and tunnel mouths of the Iron Triangle produced blast effects that burned, concussed, or killed men in the fire team stacked behind them. The 1st Infantry Division documented multiple friendly backblast casualties during Operation Cedar Falls in January 1967, and the after-action reports recommended minimum clearance distances that the jungle physically could not provide. The law cost about $35 per tube. It was the cheapest armor-killing tool in the American inventory and among the most expensive in friendly casualties when fired in the one environment where it was needed most. Number 4. The M18A1 Claymore Mine. Along the Cambodian border in late 1967, soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division set their claymores at dusk and settled into their night positions. By dawn, 3 of those mines had been turned around. The claymore sprayed 700 steel balls in a 60-degree arc, and its effectiveness depended entirely on which way the face pointed. The words "front toward enemy" were stamped into the olive drab casing, but in pitch darkness at the edge of a jungle perimeter, the front and back of a curved plastic box felt identical under a man's fingers. American units set the mines facing outward. Viet Cong sappers crawled through the wire and rotated them 180 degrees without touching the tripline. When the wire triggered, the steel balls blew straight back into the position they were meant to protect. Units along the DMZ and in the Central Highlands lost entire fire team positions to reversed claymores during peak sapper activity in 1967 and 1968. The mine was brilliant engineering, but a weapon whose lethality depends on a label you cannot read in the dark belongs to whoever reaches it last. Number 3. The M2 flamethrower. The flamethrower was the most feared weapon in the American infantry arsenal, and the men on the receiving end feared it for a reason the operator understood better than anyone. The M2 carried 4 gallons of thickened fuel in a backpack tank that sat between the operator's shoulder blades like a bullseye, and every combatant in the fight knew that one tracer round into that tank turned the carrier into a column of fire. Flamethrower operators with the Marines at Hugh City in February 1968 were the first targets the NVA snipers hunted, and their survival time in open combat was the shortest of any infantry specialist in the war. The weapon weighed close to 70 pounds loaded, making the operator the slowest man in any squad and the least able to reach cover. Its effective range was roughly 40 meters, which meant the operator had to close to grenade distance before it was useful. The Marines pulled the M2 from frontline service by 1970, not because it stopped working, but because it killed the men who carried it faster than the Corps could replace them. And yet the deadliest piece of gear in Vietnam has not appeared. Number 2. Agent Orange. The herbicide was not a weapon in any traditional sense, but it killed more Americans than most entries on this list, and it took its time doing it. Between 1962 and 1971, the Air Force sprayed roughly 11 million gallons of the chemical over Vietnam as part of Operation Ranch Hand, and the ground troops below walked through the wet residue every day. Support soldiers who handled the 55-gallon drums at air bases around Da Nang and Bien Hoa were soaked in it regularly, and their NCOs told them it was safe enough to shower in. The dioxin in Agent Orange caused cancers, nerve damage, and birth defects in the children of exposed veterans, and the Veterans Administration spent decades denying the connection while the men who had been drenched in it filed claims that went nowhere. The chemical cost about $3 a gallon in 1966. The medical bills for the men it poisoned have since run into the billions. A congressional study in the early 1990s estimated that over 300,000 veterans had been directly harmed. The spraying stopped in 1971. The dying never did. Number 1. The M16 rifle. There is no more infamous failure in American military procurement than what happened when the M16E1 arrived in Vietnam. The rifle was designed around a specific powder charge, and the Army issued it with ball powder that changed the chamber pressure and fouling rate beyond what the weapon could handle. The result was catastrophic. At the Ia Drang Valley in 1965, and at Khe San and Hue in 1968, Marines and soldiers died with jammed rifles in their hands, the bolts frozen by carbon buildup that the original powder would have prevented. Men were found beside cleaning rods, trying to clear the action during a firefight. Cleaning kits were not shipped with early batches because the manufacturer claimed the weapon was self-cleaning. Congress investigated in 1967 after letters from soldiers and their families described the rifle failing at the moment it mattered most. The M16 was eventually corrected, and the M16A1 became one of the finest combat rifles ever fielded. But between 1965 and 1968, the original jammed so often and so fatally that it belongs at the top of any list of American gear that killed American soldiers. 20 items: boots, grenades, radios, rifles, herbicides, and a flak jacket that cooked the man inside it faster than any bullet could. The men who carried this gear did not choose it. They signed for it at a supply counter and walked into a jungle where the thing on their back or in their hand could kill them as surely as any ambush on the trail. Every one of these items shipped with a contract number and a unit price, and not one of those contracts carried a line for the cost of the men it would hurt. If your father or grandfather served in Vietnam, Ask him about his gear sometime. Not the weapons he trusted, but the ones he cursed. Every veteran has one, and most have never been asked. The next video covers the other side, the gear the Viet Cong improvised from almost nothing that worked better than anything with a government stamp on it. Subscribe now so it is waiting when you are ready.